before I start with my thing, I wrote a book and I asked Jeremy Cronin, which is the second comrade in South Africa, and I asked him to review that for me, and he said, no, that's not appropriate, and I wonder why. And he said, and the reason why I asked him to review for me, review my book is because he called me an unreconstructed neoliberal fundamentalist. Now that's a good one. So that is, my subtitle of my book is Confessions of an Unreconstructed Neoliberal Fundamentalist. It's good to remember long words like this. One long word that I remember always when I go to a bride, it's important to impress certain kinds of people. So one word that I always remember, that's especially when you meet chemists or pharmacists, is oxytetracycline hydrochloride. That's a good one. And recently I've memorized another one. Let me see if I can remember that one. I'd still figure out where I'm going to fit that into. And that is tetrahydrocarbonate. Anyway, that's the active ingredient in dacha. So I have to figure out where I'm going to use that. All right, thanks a lot. All right, about economics. May I make the suggestion, and that is that economics, and we've listened to a lot of, Jana, very nice, ek dink dit was baie interessant geweest, so a lot of economic data and how to analyze the economy and so on. But I think we economists, we quite often make a mistake. And the biggest mistake that we do make is that economics is not about numbers, not about graphs and formulas and things. Economics is about one thing only, and it is about people. That's all that really matters. And economists quite often forget about that. So if there is one number that and again, that's not the only number that certainly matters, and it's another number, but one number that I certainly think is a good number to look at to see if an economy is performing properly is simply life expectancy. Because most people that I know of would like to live a long and happy life. So life expectancy is one of those numbers that correlate very well with just about everything else, everything that is good. All right, so I have to talk about ratings and rating agencies, and that's actually a very short discussion. Rating agencies are guys that tell you whether that you should invest in a specific asset or not. And it's pretty much like calling your stockbroker and asking your stockbroker, should I buy South African brewery shares? Now they've got another name. Or the efficient shares, by the way, is dit 'n punt wat ek mag gebruik? Should I buy efficient shares? Or so on. So that's pretty much the same. So what I've decided to do to expand my talk a little bit more before I get to the ratings part itself, and to start off where I think it matters in a way, and that is to start off with a question about what is a country? What is this thing that we call a country? And there's a lot of debate about whether we actually live in a country, because I think in the end, if you live in a country, is a country, and it's only a country if we all agree that it is a country. So a lot of people come together and there's an agreement between individuals that we're going to call a place from the Limpopo right through down to Cape Town, we call it South Africa, and that's it, then there's a country. If we decide to change it and break it into smaller pieces, then that's it, that's another decision that we've taken. So countries do not exist, it's simply an agreement between individuals. But having said that, let's assume that the thing like a country or a state exists. Then what is the functions of the state? And I think there are two functions for the state. The one function, and let me just add to this. I'm going to give you some theory, and I'm going to explain how certain things fit together, the way I understand it at least. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree with this. So there are two functions of the state. The one is that the state is supposed to make money. That's what the state do. And the other thing, the other category of things is the rest, the other things that the state do. So let's just first talk about money and whether the state should be the creator of money. Before I get to whether the state should be creating money, maybe just comment about money. Money is probably the most important discovery that we have made. Oh, a couple of other ones that are very important as well. Private property, the right protection, the discovery of alcohol was a major one as well. And then the third one, the discovery of money. That was the most amazing discovery. Why is money such an important thing? Money is such an important thing because it makes it easier for people to trade. It facilitates trade. It reduces the cost and the friction associated with trade. And the more advanced money is, and the more cheaper it makes this transaction between individuals, and that's the closest one can get to something called a free lunch. So money is important because it's easier to extract value out of trade with money that is properly, sound money. Governments, of course, they've decided the money evolved over time, and governments decided, as always, that they want to get into the party, and they started taking over money. And in all instances where governments took over money, in all instances, without one single exception, they have either destroyed money or they are in the process of destroying money. They have never been successful in the thousands of years that we've had money to manage money successfully over time. No government has ever done that. And they're doing very weird things nowadays. They like, for example, they print money, they give it fancy names like quantitative easing. Ace Magashule calls it quality easing. He's got it a little bit wrong. So quantitative easing, and they also do other weird things, and that is they cut interest rates to below zero. Now that is a very surreal kind of world that central banks are creating. Don't tell me central banks are independent. Central banks are part of government or the state. Central banks are, I know they like to think they are independent, but they're not really. So central banks create money out of nothing. They give it to politicians to spend. They call it fancy names. But central banks also reduce interest rates to below zero, and that leads to massive distortions on the world financial market. So I'm not going to talk too much about money anymore. But let's get to the other one, and that's the rest. What else are governments or the state responsible for? Well, I guess that depends. That's a political question. If you ask the Marxists, they're going to tell you, or the communists is perhaps a better word, they're going to tell you that the state should be responsible for just about everything. The state should be the owner of resources, all resources of to produce in an economy, and the state should take all these sort of decisions. That's the one extreme. But there's a way of determining what the state should be involved in, or where the state should participate, or what parts of the economy the state should be participating in, especially in something called a democracy. Now, a democracy, that's also a matter of definition. What is a democracy? For example, if the majority decides that the people with blue eyes should be shot, is that a democratic decision? And I would argue and say, no, that's not a democratic decision, because it's nothing to do with the majority, what the colors of somebody's eyes are, or many other things that individuals decide to do or not to do. Nothing to do with the majority. And I would argue that a democracy are those things on which the exclusion principle cannot be applied. You'll see how that fits in. Now, the exclusion principle is simply the following. It is impossible, for example, to exclude people from certain services that the state provide. Like, for example, defense. That's the classic example. The state provides defense, and you will get defended whether you like that or not. And for that reason, we should all have a democratic say in this decision over things like, for example, defense. It is, however, possible to exclude somebody from consuming a bottle of brandy if that person doesn't pay. You simply hold back your bottle of brandy. You don't sell it to him. You just don't give it to him until he's paid. So you can exclude a person from consuming brandy by not giving him the bottle until he's paid. But you cannot exclude somebody from getting the benefits of defense. And that is what a democracy should be about. When you cannot exclude somebody from decisions, or when you cannot exclude somebody from getting the benefits, and that's in inverted commas benefits, but getting the benefits of certain services, then that should be part of a democracy, and that should be part of collective decision making. But if you can exclude a person from a certain good or a service, then that's nothing to do with democracy, and that is simply should be left to the individual to decide for him or herself. All right, so that is the theory behind the whole thing, and it starts off with a democracy and the definition of what is a democracy. So once we've decided that we're going to live in a democracy, a democracy that's limited to things from which you cannot exclude individuals, what are the primary functions of the state? And there are a couple of primary functions of the state. I've already mentioned defense as one of the primary functions of the state. Another primary function of the state is police. The state is supposed to be responsible for law and order. And a third primary function of the state is contract enforcement, or the judiciary, so to speak. Those are the three major functions of the state and the things that the state is supposed to be doing. But in the modern world in which we are living in, the state has become responsible for all sorts of other things as well. Like, for example, infrastructural development. And by the way, there's a very good, and I'm interrupting myself, infrastructural development. It's fairly easy to fund infrastructural development simply by a user charge. And that's part of the reason why I am, in principle, in favor of the toll roads in South Africa. Because the user should pay. So you can fund infrastructure. So don't come with an argument saying that we have to pay taxes because the state must invest in infrastructure. The state can still provide infrastructure or the private sector can do that for that matter, and you can fund that with a user charge. But nevertheless, so some secondary functions of the state are things like, for example, the provision of infrastructure, certain other services like, for example, health services, education services, airlines, for example. Those are some examples of some secondary functions of the state. Well, I can't think of any good reason why the state should have an airline in the case of South Africa as an example, but it's interesting to see that in literature there's quite a bit of an overlap. Even if you look at things like, for example, health services, and one can actually argue that a health service is in fact a collective good, a good over which we should decide democratically, and we should all then be funding this specific good. And one of the reasons why some people argue that the health services should actually be part of the primary functions of the state is because it's a good idea to inoculate everybody in the country against some sort of illness, because everybody gets the benefit if everybody else are actually inoculated against this kind of illness. And for that reason, health, as an example, should be one of the primary functions of the state as well. So clearly, it's not a clear cut, it's not black and white thing. There are overlaps between the functions that the state should and should not be providing. One specific function that is quite often mentioned as one of those functions that the state should be providing is the function of redistribution. The function of redistribution is simply for the state to take from some guys, rich guys, and give it to somebody else. Now, I've done some numbers, and in the case of South Africa, the South African fiscus is the most redistributive fiscus in the world. Remember, redistribution takes place on two levels. Who is doing the actual payment, who are paying the various taxes, and who are on the receiving end of state spending. And the guys paying the taxes in South Africa are mostly not the guys getting the benefits of state spending. And the South African fiscus is probably the most redistributive fiscus in the world. And depending how you want to calculate that, but in some instances, say, for example, if you earn R1 million per year, then for every R1, assuming the state is effective and efficient, which is a completely ridiculous assumption, but let's assume that for every R1 that you pay tax, you probably get back something like 2 cents or so. Back in the form of benefits from the state. So redistribution is seen as one of those functions of the state as well. And that brings me then to the next thing, and what is all of this needs to be funded, and how do you fund that? And that is the question on what an ideal tax system should look like. Now, of course, there are a couple of requirements for a tax system. One is that it must bring in money. That's one requirement. Another one, it must be relatively cheap and easy to administer. Another requirement, it must be fair, as an example. And then there's the question about equality, and there's another question about non-distortive. And I want to spend a little bit of time on these two issues. The first question is about equality. So one of the requirements for a good tax system, and that's a bit of an oxymoron, a good tax system. All taxes are always bad. But let's assume that there is something like less bad and more bad taxes. What is this thing called equality? When is something equal? And there are different ways of looking at equality. There are 3 different categories of equality, and let's think of a simplified world where there are a couple of individuals and we have to tax these couple of individuals to fund certain expenses of the state, and we want to do it on an equal basis. So there are 3 levels of equality. The first level of equality is that of an absolute equality. Absolute equality simply means everybody pays exactly the same. We all pay R1,000 per month, that's it. And we have systems like that. It's called a poll tax. It used to be called the poll tax, and we had poll taxes even in South Africa a couple of, 150 whatever odd years ago. And if you go to places like, for example, these estates in which we are living today, typically they will charge a poll tax in a way. It's a poll tax on a family, mostly, but that's a kind of an absolute equal tax. So an absolute equality simply means everybody pays exactly the same. And theoretically, let me just interrupt myself again, theoretically an absolute equal tax is also the least distortive of all the taxes. I'll get to distortion just now. The second level of equality, now if we try to implement an absolute equal tax in South Africa, everybody pays R1,000 a month, for example, Kusalto is not going to like that, okay? So we need to move to some other kind of equality. And another level of equality, or other kind of equality is a relative equality. Relative equality simply means that everybody pays 10% of your income, as an example. But that, of course, there are some flaws in that argument as well. And in fact, Kusati and other guys that also do not understand economics will also not be happy with relative equality. They want something else, getting me to the third kind of equality, and that is progressive equality, which has no basis in philosophy or in theory. It's something that was created out of thin air, so-called progressive equality. And that's what we have in South Africa. In fact, most countries in the world have progressive taxes of one sort or the other. Now, there are many, many ideological or philosophical arguments against a progressive equality, like, for example, the marginal utility of money. If you believe in a progressive income tax, then you must assume that the marginal utility of money is the same for everybody, which certainly is not the case. But that is nowadays the answer to taxes, and that taxes should be progressive. And then we've got the silly idea that somehow it is equal or progressive equality in one way or the other. So that is as far as taxes are concerned. There's another requirement of a good tax system, and that is that it must be a non-distortive. Now, what that means is that it must be neutral as far as resource allocation in your economy is concerned. Now, let me just explain this in a way. Maybe if I have some time, I can tell you a quick story. Let me tell you this quick story. Just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a bunch of Russian economists decided to visit the London agricultural market, which is quite a big place where they buy and sell all sort of agricultural produce. And they were very impressed with this place, going through this London agricultural market. But the tour leader could see that something was bothering this bunch of Russian economists. And at the end of the tour, he asked them, so what do you think? And they said, this is really impressive. This thing called capitalism really works. I mean, this is wow. But they have one question. And the question is, where are the surpluses? That's what they ask. Where are the surpluses? Now, if you understand the difference between a free market system and a communist system, that is the difference in that question. Where are the surpluses? Because in a communist system, remember, in a centralized system, you have committees of economists, and economists can really distort stuff, and economists can do a lot of damage. So economists in these different committees will decide how to allocate resources to the various production entities. Like, for example, to a farm, how much diesel to give to the farm, how much fertilizer to give to the farm. And as always, and I'm not even talking about the inefficiency of the system, I'm only talking about the principle behind collective, this so-called collective centralized decision-making is that economists will decide how much fertilizer and stuff or resources to give to a farm, and usually, or to a factory. And usually what they will do, they will under-allocate and give too little resources to a specific farm, and they will not produce as much as they hoped to produce, so there will be a shortage of something on the specific farm or produced or on the specific factory. But due to the nature of shortages, you cannot see shortages because it's not there. That's why you can't see it. But sometimes economists make a mistake, an opposite mistake, and sometimes they over-allocate resources. Now, there's an example of a factory in Tomsk, a city in Siberia, where they manufacture titanium. And there's one instance, one year, where they totally over-allocated. They made some big mistake somewhere. They gave too much resources to this factory producing and manufacturing titanium, and they produced a huge surplus of titanium. Remember, in a communist system, the prices of things are also fixed. Prices do not go up and down. So there was this huge surplus, and hence the question, where are the surpluses? And you can see surpluses. And that's the problem when you allow economists or anybody to allocate resources, because they will either give too little or too much resources to a production unit, leading to shortages, which you can't see, or to surpluses, which you can see. And that's the reason for the question, by this Russian economist. By the way, because of the surpluses in this titanium that they've produced in the city, people started making use of titanium to build the roofs of their houses. All right. So that's one of the requirements for a tax system, not to distort resource allocation in the economy, because in a free market system, prices keep on going up and down, and resources are continuously allocated to the various places in the economy, to the various production units, from between producers and consumers. And it tells consumers, if the tomato price goes up, it tells us consume fewer tomatoes and start consuming something more, something else. And that's exactly how the allocation of resources in the economy work. And the moment you interfere with the allocation process of resources in the economy, then the allocation process becomes suboptimal. And a moment that happens, there will be less trade, and the moment there's less trade, there will be fewer free lunches. And that's one requirement for a good tax system, to be as neutral as possible. There's no such thing as a good tax, but you get more distortive taxes than others. And that is why a poll tax, theoretically, is the least distortive of all taxes. So, talking about the fiscal stuff, we've listened to a lot of bad news about the fiscal stuff. The fiscus, by the way, the word fiscus means basket. It's a Latin word in which people or the taxman used to collect taxes. It was called a fiscus. And from then on, we call the fiscal accounts, we call it the fiscal accounts. And that's the numbers that the Minister of Finance is responsible for. There's a set of numbers, we call it the fiscal matrix, and the fiscal matrix consists of, and you've listened to some of the previous presentation, some of those numbers, consists of a number of numbers. One is state revenue or state income, primarily from the various taxes. In the case of South Africa, personal income tax, which is a progressive tax, is by far the single most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance, followed by the second most important tax, and that is value-added tax. Remember, personal income tax is a tax on income, while a value-added tax is a tax on consumption. That's the second most important tax to the Minister of Finance, and the third most important tax to the Minister of Finance is company taxes. And looking at the various taxes and how they react during an economic growth and during times of economic slowdown, you can actually read quite a lot on what is going on in that particular economy. What we have seen in South Africa in recent years, for instance, is that corporate tax collections has been slowing down, and that is usually an indication of an economy that has been slowing down. We have seen quite a dramatic increase in personal income tax collections, primarily because of an increase in personal income taxes in recent years. So not only is it very progressive, our tax system, it is getting more and more progressive over time. And if you also analyze what economists call the elasticity of tax collections, you will see that as the economy grows, which is not happening that much, but as the economy growing, tax collections is not necessarily increasing at the same rate, telling me that people are actively trying to pay as little tax as possible in South Africa. So that is the revenue side. On the spending side is another very important number. The most important spending number for the Minister of Finance is on education, followed by a couple of other expense items as well. In the recent years, what we've seen in South Africa is the biggest increase on state spending has been especially on the civil servant wage bill, and I've analyzed those numbers myself. An average civil servant in South Africa, compared to the private sector equivalent, is paid between roughly about 40%, and some instances as much as 120% more than the private sector equivalent. We have, depending on your definition, between 1.2 and 3 million civil servants in South Africa. They are highly overpaid, and I would also argue in most instances mostly underworked as well. And that's the primary reason why we've seen a huge increase in state spending in recent years. It was good in the beginning. It was very nice if you overpay your civil servants, because they use this money to buy flat screen TVs and beamers and new houses, and that is good for consumption in the economy, demand in the economy, but eventually you run out of other people's money, to use Margaret Thatcher's words. All right. Then there's another, amongst these numbers, the fiscal matrix, there's one very important number, and that is called the fiscal deficit. Now, those of you that don't, and you've seen that in the previous presentation, many things in the economy, many of these aggregates are expressed as a percentage of the economy. We call it the percentage of GDP, which is pretty much flawed, but at least it's wrong, but at least it's consistently wrong. So we can compare things over time. So one of those numbers that economists always express as a percentage of GDP is the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is, this is how much the politicians spend, this much are they getting in by way of the various taxes, and the difference between the two is how much they need to borrow. And that's called the fiscal deficit, and currently in South Africa, the fiscal deficit is equal to approximately 6% to GDP. Okay, now here's a party trick. If you don't understand economics, know anything about economics, remember this one. Here's a party trick. You meet a new economist and you try to impress him with a fancy word. That's the first one. The second thing that you do, you meet a new economist at the bar and you tell him, listen, what is your country's fiscal deficit? And he will tell you, like for the case in South Africa, it is 6% of GDP. Then you ask him, so what is your fiscal debt? And in the case of South Africa, he will tell you your fiscal debt currently, also expressed as a percentage of GDP in South Africa, is 58% to GDP. Then you ask him, so what is your economic growth? And then he's going to say, if he comes from South Africa, it is approximately 1%, which it isn't. It's approximately 0.5%, but let's call it 1%. And here's the party trick. So fiscal deficit, 6% to GDP. Debt, 58% to GDP as is. Economic growth, 1%, take that away from the fiscal deficit, and 5% is the rate at which the debt to GDP ratio will go up in this period. Easy. So fiscal deficit minus economic growth is the rate at which fiscal debt to GDP will keep on going up year from year. Currently, we have a fiscal deficit or fiscal debt of about 58% to GDP in South Africa, and that means by the end of this fiscal year, remember the fiscal year of the state starts on a very appropriate date, and that's the 1st of April. So the 1st of April, we will enter the new financial year with fiscal debt to GDP ratio of about 62%. All right, so what is debt? What is everything included? Now, the debt number I've just given you is a so-called gross debt number, which is the number that the Minister of Finance is not using. He usually uses the net gross number, or the net debt number. The Reserve Bank prefers to use the gross debt number, and that's in line with the IMF and the World Bank as well. So you get the gross debt, which is currently standing about 58% to GDP, but there are some balances of the state at the banks and also the South African Reserve Bank. The Minister of Finance deducts that usually, and that will give you a net number, which is approximately 4% below the gross number, which will give us a debt to GDP ratio of 55% or so. I prefer to use the gross number because that is the convention, which is 58% at the moment. And I've also not included the state-owned enterprises at debt yet. Now, in the case of only Eskom's, and remember, Eskom belongs to the state. People call Eskom a company. It's not. It's just another state department. They are not, so they call themselves a board, and they've got a chairman of the board. That's nonsense, of course. That's not the real board. Real boards and real companies go bankrupt, not in the state-owned enterprises. They like to get the benefits and the fancy titles, but they're not prepared to take the responsibilities. But anyway, if you take the debt of the state-owned enterprises and you add that to the gross debt of the state, which one should. Now, total outstanding debt to GDP currently is just over 70% to GDP at the moment, and increasing at an alarming rate. But of course, you have to include some other stuff as well. Like what, for example, the local authorities, which got huge numbers of outstanding debt. 2/3 of the local authorities are financial dysfunctional, just by the way. And the road accident fund, which is also running at a huge deficit. And we all add all those debts. So it really depends on your definition. If you all add all of that together, then the total outstanding debt of the expanded definition of the state is probably around about 90% to GDP. And we are indeed in a fiscal debt trap already. A fiscal debt trap means that you can't get out of this very easily, and that's where we are at the moment. Maybe, and this is I know some guys are saying that some economists and some political analysts are saying that we will be forced to go to the IMF for a loan. I disagree with that, and part of the reason why I say so is because the total reserves in dollar terms that is at the South African Reserve Bank is approximately $50 billion, in excess of $50 billion, and the total outstanding debt of the central government of the state at the moment is much less than that, and it only needs to be repaid over time. So I don't think we're going to need an IMF loan. The only benefit of an IMF loan is to use that as an excuse for certain structural adjustments in South Africa. And I think that's a valid reason, but we do not need an IMF loan. One of the very, very few good things that the ANC government has done is not to borrow too much money abroad. They've recently borrowed some 50 billion euros again, but the total outstanding debt, foreign debt, and dollar-denominated or foreign-denominated debt is actually a relatively small portion of total outstanding debt. That's on the IMF. Coming back to the rating agencies. So what do rating agencies look at? They look for. First of all, they look for what they call political stability. Now, what is political stability? Political stability are things like, for example, policy certainty. Political stability are things like, for example, is democracy working properly, which I guess we can say that in South Africa, but we have a lot of policy uncertainties in South Africa. Hopefully we will have more policy certainty, which I really doubt, after this new panel will be put together consisting of 18 economists. Now that is going to be a lot of confusion. I can tell you, if you put 2 economists into one room, you get a lot of different opinions. 18 economists into one room. And that, I guess, is part of the problem in South Africa, that we have a president, we have a government that is without vision. We have a president that is not leading, he's always looking for somebody else to tell him what to do. That's part of the problem. Nothing wrong with the president getting advice, but it's all he does. He's getting advice, he makes a plan, then they keep on revising the plan, like what is exactly happening with Tito's plan at the moment. So that's political certainty and policy certainty, and I'm afraid we simply do not have that in South Africa. The clearest form of policy certainty that we do have in South Africa is the budget of the Minister of Finance. That at least is a piece of paper that try to stick with that. And I must tell you, I like Tito Mboweni as the Minister of Finance. At least he's got a plan. At least he's leading. Unfortunately, he's got a boss that he needs to listen to sometimes as well. The second important number that the rating agencies look at, and that's perhaps an even more important number, is economic growth. Now, I told you my economic growth estimates for this year. In fact, the South African economy seems to be stuck in an economic growth trajectory of about 1%. In a good year, 1.5%, a bad year, about 0.5% or so, around about 1% or so. This year, I expect economic growth about 0.5% or so, and next year probably around about the same, 1% or so. Keep in mind that the population is expanding at a rate of about 1.6%. So it's no wonder that we have unemployment levels where they are, and it's no wonder that we see poverty keep on going up. And that leads to more social tension and political tension and the like. So economic growth, I would argue, is perhaps of all these numbers the single most important number. And then lastly, and traditionally the most important number that the rating agencies will look at will be the fiscal matrix. And that's state revenue, state spending, and the debt levels and stuff like that. Now, I've told you where South Africa's debt levels are at the moment, and the result of debt primarily, and also very weak economic growth, is that it's very, very likely that we will be getting another downgrade also from Moody's. Now, there's a joke amongst economists, and that is that if you work for a company that lists certain financial instruments and you need a rating, go to Moody's, because it's quite easy to get a rating from Moody's, an investment rating from Moody's. So Moody's is known as one of those softer rating agencies in the market. And currently Moody's is the only one of the 3 major rating agencies that still consider South Africa's state debt as of investment grade. And I have a suspicion, especially based on the recent trajectory on which we find ourselves as far as the fiscal accounts are concerned, that we will be seeing another downgrade eventually also from Moody's, and further downgrades from the others. And remember, it's not only a matter of investment grade and junk bonds, you get different levels of junk. So you can get into junkest. And we are probably, it's only a matter of time before we will be downgraded by Moody's as well. What will be the result of that? There's a lot of debate around that, but I've got a suspicion it's going to lead to, it can, initially at least, lead to quite a substantial outflow of capital out of South Africa. If all this money leaves South Africa, and there are debates how much can potentially leave, and it varies between a 20 billion rand outflow to as much as a 200 billion rand outflow. If that should happen, the 200 billion outflow, that will lead to huge impact on the exchange rate of the currency. So I don't know how much is going to leave South Africa. My suspicion is probably will be around about the tens of billions and not around the hundreds of billions. If that should happen, the rand will take a huge knock, and the rand is a hugely undervalued currency as it is. Currently, it's more undervalued than usual. I've done some numbers on that, and the rand is actually more, and that's, by the way, why I also advise my clients to put a substantial portion of their investments abroad because of the currency and the very volatile nature of the South African currency. So the rand is likely to take a significant knock. If the rand takes a knock, then of course we will have upward pressure on inflation as well, which will, of course, get the Reserve Bank, because we have a conservative central banker, to likely tighten monetary policy, increase interest rates a little bit, which will lead to even weaker economic growth, even higher levels of unemployment, even higher inflation levels and the like. So it's not going to be good news if we do get another downgrade. But some good news, and that is that South Africa has, and one of the few things that work very, very well in South Africa, the Reserve Bank, by the way, is one of those, but something else that works very well in South Africa is that we have exceptionally well regulated, very much integrated, and very liquid financial markets. Our financial markets are of the best in the world. Really, you can compare it to just about anybody else. I just came back from London, and I can tell you that we do not have to stand back for anybody anywhere in the world. Our banks, our financial markets are really, really sophisticated and very important, very liquid. So we have a currency that is hugely undervalued, and we have very, very attractive yields on our bond market, for example, and we have this huge pool of money or financial assets that are very, very liquid. And this is what I think is going to happen if we do get a downgrade. The initial reaction by the financial markets will be negative, with the rand and interest rates and all that. But I think soon after that, especially the speculators will say, but come on, this is a cheap currency, cheap entrance with very, very attractive yields that we will get in South Africa. And I've got a suspicion we could even see a substantial sudden inflow of capital into South Africa. Unfortunately, it will be of the hot, what we call portfolio flows, or hot money inflows, money that can quite as easily leave South Africa again. So the result of a downgrade is likely to be maybe initial weaker currency and initial negative impact, but thereafter an inflow of capital again back into South Africa, but much more volatile money. And if something goes wrong, the money will leave South Africa very quickly again, leading to a very, very volatile currency and everything else, and that's not good. Certainly not good. I don't think it's a one-way bet, though, and I think that's important to understand, but certainly there's a possibility that the rand can even not appreciate after the event. And maybe just one or two and three final comments that I would like to make. We are in a fiscal debt trap. We are in very deep trouble. If we want to stabilize debt to GDP ratio, the state needs to cut spending by 15% 1 year to the next. That is politically nearly impossible to do. It can be done, but it's nearly impossible to do. So we are in deep trouble. Secondly, we have probably the most destructive government this country has ever seen. The damage done by the ANC and the ANC coalition cannot be measured. And then lastly, my advice to people is never break any laws, but pay as little tax as possible. Thank you for listening to me.
Hartlike welkom by Sakeplein. Sake wat? Goeie vraag. Ek sal verduidelik. Sakeplein is eintlik baie eenvoudig. Dit is 'n markplein aanlyn. Lys jou besigheid, lok nuwe klante, kry sakevennote, kom by mekaar sakekamers en nog baie meer. Om te sien wat Sakeplein en sy mense vir jou kan doen, registreer vandag jouself of jou besigheid op sakeplein.com. Sakeplein. Skep waarde, maak wins.